Good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Texas at Dallas and our annual Einspruch Lecture. I'm Hobson Wildenthal, the Provost of UT Dallas, and it is today, as it has been every year for many years now, a great pleasure and a great privilege for me to be able to welcome our guests and our faculty and staff and students to the Einspruch Lecture. Our Holocaust Studies program has made truly remarkable positive progress over the last several years, thanks to many, many dedicated, talented people. And by the way, I'm known as a hard evaluator within the university community. Don't give that many A's, but I will give a great high grade to our faculty and our students and staff, and most of all our community supporters for the advances we've made in the Holocaust Studies program. The Einspruch Lecture is one of the first jewels in our crown, so it's now a tradition named for Dr. Burton Einspruch, who's with us here today. Bert, where are you? And I've got to restrain myself because there's so many great supporters of our program here in the audience, but I'm going to limit it to only one more name, and that is a true inspirational leader over the last several years, Mr. Ed Ackerman, for whom we have named our Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. Ed, thank you for being with us. And we've been talking today and excitedly over the last weeks and months, but thanks to Mr. Ackerman's leadership, the Holocaust Studies program is now housed in, I would say, the second most elegant quarters at UT Dallas, the first being the McDermott Suite. But the Ackerman Center is truly elegant and functional for students and faculty alike. So we'll hope that all of you come by and visit us soon in the future. And it's being furnished by, again, a great outpouring of support from our community supporters. So now, again, not for the first time, several years, a great privilege to introduce Sully Belofsky, the chairman of our advisory board. Sully?
Thank you, Hobson. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces here. You know, Hobson is probably the number one leader of the Holocaust Studies program here at UT Dallas, because none of this could have been made possible if it weren't for his support. And the newest is the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, which will be dedicated on April 3rd. There'll be a ribbon cutting ceremony. And it's 2,100 square feet of offices for our 4 professors, a library, a media room, conference rooms. It's really exquisite. I got a peek at it about 10 days ago. Hobson calls himself a hard evaluator, but really he is a great leader because he always gives credit to everybody else and never to himself. And on the campus, he's affectionately known as Sir, or Dr. Wildenthal. But anyway, he is the driving force behind this whole program. We have a couple of other people that I think deserve to be recognized. We have Dennis Kratz here, who's the dean of the School of Arts and Humanities. I saw him a minute ago. Dennis, that's with the eye patch. Thank you for coming, Dennis. And a past member of our advisory board, Professor Ivor Robinson. Ivor, would you stand? Not many people know this, but Ivor Robinson is the man who recruited Pishta Ashwath to the campus here. Pishta and Juji were living in Hamburg, and known for his brilliance in mathematics, and this was during the Cold War, and America was looking for brains from Europe, and Ivor was chartered with the idea of building the campus and bringing the best talent in the world here, and he found Istvan, and when Istvan came, Juji Ashwath came. So that's a little bit of history, but we're indebted to Ivor, and without him, it never would have happened either. So thank you for coming, Ivor. You know, they say that if you want to change the world, you start with education. Our motto here at the UT Holocaust Studies program is teaching the past, changing the future. And there are a lot of universities that do teach Holocaust studies, many of them part of the history department or part of the School of Arts and Humanities, but usually it's one professor or two professors, and then they borrow professors from other departments. The difference here at UT Dallas is that we have 4 full-time professors, all dedicated to teaching European history and the Holocaust, which is very, very unusual. And we grant PhD and master's degrees and certificates in Holocaust studies to our students here, and many of them go on to teach in colleges and universities around the country. Our 4 professors teach 16 different courses a year to over 500 students of every background, every religion, and every race. So we really have a lot to be thankful for. There's really no way to evaluate specifically or perfectly the impact that the Holocaust Studies program has on this generation or future generations. But I'd like to read to you just excerpts from a letter that Professor Ashwath got from one of her former students about 2 months ago. As you know, Professor Ashwath just published her personal memoir called When the Danube Ran Red. And so she got this letter from a past student of hers, and I'd like to read it to you. Dear Dr. Ashwath, thank you for writing and publishing your remarkable story. Reading about the terror you, your family, and others lived was painful. I am glad that I know now more about you. What a beautiful family, including Urzi, you had. Thank you for sharing your, quote, self. I was your student from 1983 to 1985. I wrote to you several years ago to give you some small idea of the impact you have on my life. Like drops in a pool, your sensitivity, your intellect, and your humanity continue to move out in ever-widening circles, touching many, including myself. I feel honored and grateful to have been your student. I think of you often. Recently, I think of you daily, as I have again taken up reading about and discussing the Holocaust and genocide with those with whom I come into contact. Most, of course, seek to distance themselves. After all, if they allow their minds to go to that dark place, then that place becomes real and possible yet again. Because of you and your story and your enlightening instruction, more people will know and remember what we must all understand took place and continues to happen every day. How immeasurably important keeping the memories alive becomes when we hear the news of the world and look at our children. How much better it is to teach compassion and tolerance than hate and bigotry. And then there's some personal stuff, and then it says, I am grateful to you and for you, and I wish you many blessings with love, and then she signs her name. That's a moving, I think, testimonial to Professor Ashwath and our other professors here and the importance of the work that they do. and it leaves no question in my mind that they are teaching the past and changing the future. Here the students learn not only the history of the Holocaust, but the lessons of the Holocaust. The lessons of tolerance, compassion, and respect for all people, and the consequences of hate, ignorance, and silence. So thank you all again for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ashvath, who will introduce our guest speaker. Juji.
Thank you, Sally. It's really difficult after such introduction somehow stand here and give an objective report about what will come, but I try my best. First of all, I know that everybody has thanked everybody, but I just would like to repeat some of these thanks. I would like to tell you, because it's one of the most important things that we all know, that none of this, not your presence, not our teaching on that level in which it takes place, could have happened without the help and interest in Holocaust studies and dedication of Vice President Hobson Wildenthal. It is him. It is his encouragement, really, throughout all these years that have made the program possible. So I really want to thank him deeply. Coming to, before I introduce Professor Jeff Herf, I would like to call your attention to index cards which you have in your programs. And I would like to tell you, just as you listen to the lecture of Professor Herf, to jot down some of your ideas or questions you would like to ask, so that at the end we can have a question and answer period and go through some of these questions you have asked. That would be very nice. We had also pencils there. I hope that you have instruments of writing if you have forgotten to, or if you have not picked up any of those pencils. So what I would like to do now, I would like to introduce to you Professor Jeffrey Herf, who comes from the University of Maryland, and whose book we have used this semester. We have studied his book, The Jewish Enemy. And it has made such an impact on the class that I thought to be very appropriate to invite him and to have his input and to have your questions and to have his explanations that he has given in this book to all of you who have not had a chance to read it, as well as to those who have read it. So I would like to say that Professor Jeff Herf is a professor of history in Maryland, and that he is one of the best-known scholars of the field of Holocaust studies and German history. He has written many books and many major articles that appeared in major journals and anthologies and all over the place. He also, it's an important, among the many important things that he has achieved, I would like to mention just one or two, and that is he has been the fellow of the American Academy in Berlin. And the fellow, the George Herbert Walker Bush Fellow in that academy. And he also has won the Jewish National Book Award. But as I am saying, this is just many of the honors he has achieved, and we are very much looking forward to hear Professor Jeffrey Herf.
Thank you, Professor Oshvat. It's a real honor to be delivering the Einspruch lecture, in part because some of my very good friends and have given previous Einspruch lectures. And it's always very nice to be put in the company of these people. It's also very impressive to see high-ranking officials of a university attend a lecture like this. As Woody Allen said, showing up is 90% of life. And a lot of administrators are often too busy to come to lectures like this. So it means a lot that you're here to me, and it's clear that there's very strong commitment to support this scholarly enterprise here. Let's get down to business. In two recent works, The Jewish Enemy and Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, I've examined Nazi Germany's anti-Semitic propaganda directed both at its domestic German audience as well as at Arabic listeners in North Africa and in the Middle East. This afternoon, I want to summarize my findings, present some of the key pieces of evidence, and tell you why I think these works make an important contribution to explaining why the Holocaust took place and why it almost took place in other places. Like my fellow historians, I have worked a great deal in archives, poring over thousands of documents that were not intended to see the light of day. And these documents offer crucial insights into the decision-making processes of the Nazi regime. Yet as a historian of the intersection of ideas and politics, I have paid particular attention to the very public, very famous or infamous texts that appeared on the front pages of German and sometimes foreign newspapers and were broadcast on German and foreign language radio broadcasts. And what I have learned, and what I want to point out to you today, is that often the truth was hiding in plain sight, but that the truth about Nazi intentions was so bizarre and so absurd that, as Karl Bracher, one of the greatest historians of Nazism, once wrote, the history of National Socialism was also the history of its underestimation. Taking seriously what the Nazis said in public turns out to be a very productive research strategy. Historians, as you know, think about change and continuity. With reference to the Holocaust, this general concern led to the following question: why did centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe lead for the first time between 1939 and 1945 to an attempt not only to persecute the Jews or kill them in pogroms, but to a final solution, and that is an attempt to kill all the Jews of Europe? Certainly, the Holocaust would not have taken place without centuries of Christian-inspired hatred of the Jews, or without the secular racist doctrines and conspiracy theories of the 19th and 20th century. In this sense, it was an event within the intellectual and cultural history of Europe. Yet these background conditions were a necessary but not sufficient set of conditions. The leap from what Saul Friedlander called an era of persecution to an era of extermination took place in a specific historical context. And that context was Hitler's decision to launch a Second World War. in his speeches, the essays and speeches of his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and in the directives to the German press about how they should spin the daily news, Hitler and his associates drew on a radical anti-Semitism to interpret the course of events. For the Nazis, radical anti-Semitism was not only a prejudice or a form of intolerance. Radical anti-Semitism was an ideology. It was an interpretation. It was an interpretation of contemporary history, and for Hitler and his associates, radical anti-Semitism unlocked the secrets of contemporary history. Hitler justified his leap over the abyss from policies of persecution to those of extermination with an interpretation of World War II rooted in this radical anti-Semitic ideology. In the propaganda, ideology became a narrative, a story, and the daily and weekly news about events. In their inner office memos and on the front pages of the newspapers, the Nazis claimed that they were waging what they called a war against the Jews. As many of you will recall, the historian of the Holocaust, Lucy Davidovich, published a very famous book in the 1970s called The War Against the Jews. And with that phrase, she was referring to what we call the Holocaust. But when the Nazis used the phrase, the war against the Jews, they were not only referring to the final solution of the Jewish question. They were also referring to the big war, the war against Britain, against the Soviet Union, against the United States and their allies. Because the Nazis claimed that these powers had become tools and stooges of Jews working behind the scenes in London and Moscow and Washington. And when they referred to World War II, they often called it the Jewish War. And they tried to convince people in this country and all over the world that that is what it was. And by the Jewish War, they referred to one overarching international and not only European apocalyptic battle that was waged between two very powerful antagonists. On the one hand, there was a very powerful antagonist called international or world Jewry. It was a real existing political actor like the Comintern or the War Department in the United States or the British Parliament. And this political actor was working behind the scenes, and it had seized power in London, Moscow, and Washington, and it had launched World War II against Nazi Germany. It had created an astonishing alliance, an unexpected and unnatural alliance between the capitalist democracies of Britain and the United States on the one hand, and Stalin's communist Soviet Union on the other. This Jewish enemy was waging a war of extermination, the Nazis said, a Vernichtungs- or Ausrottungskrieg against the German people, and not just the Nazi regime. And so, in retaliation against this outrageous criminal assault on an innocent Germany, Hitler announced that such a war would not end with the extermination of the Germans or what he called the Aryan race in Europe, but it would end rather with the extermination of Europe's Jews. From the first time that he uttered this infamous prophecy in a speech on January 30th of 1939 to the day he committed suicide in the bunker in Berlin on April 30th of 1945, paranoia and projection were the handmaidens of his regime's policies of aggression and genocide. Whether in the euphoric days of victory of 1939 to 42, or in the grim several years of setback and defeat from 1943 on, the Nazis believed they had found the explanation of things that they had found so difficult to grasp. Why, for example, and this explanation explained the inexplicable. It offered an explanation to the key riddle of contemporary history, such as Franklin Roosevelt's inexplicable decision to wage an undeclared war in the Atlantic Ocean beginning in 1939 against German submarines. Britain's finest hour and Churchill's refusal to negotiate in the summer of 1940. Churchill's decision to immediately offer an alliance to the Soviet Union in June of 1941 when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The entry of the United States into the war in 1941, the assault of the Red Army on the Eastern Front, the Anglo-American bombing of German industries and cities, and then to the persistence of this coalition to unconditional victory in May of 1945. In all of these instances, the headlines of the daily official paper of the regime, the Völkischer Beobachter, the People's Observer, and the broadcasts on radio in Germany and in many languages beamed via shortwave radio around the world and in Europe, declared that it was international Jewry, in Joseph Goebbels' words, that was the glue that held this enemy coalition together. Amidst the myriad complexities of the day, the Nazis repeated one simple message. By waging this supposed war of extermination against the Germans, the Jews had signed their own death warrant. Hitler, Goebbels, and others repeatedly said in public that they, the Nazis, were engaged in exterminating the Jews of Europe as an act of simple self-defense and retaliation. Yet the Nazi assertions regarding the supposed acts of international Jewry had another implication, one that we haven't thought enough about. For if the Jewish enemy of the Nazi imagination was truly international, and if it was, as Hitler and Goebbels said, a race, all of whose members were part of this vast conspiracy, then were not the Jews everywhere in the world just as guilty as the Jews of Europe? While the Nazis could not soon hope to get their hands on the Jews who supposedly were running the show in Washington and London, there were a sizable group of Jews who were possibly within striking distance of the armed forces of the Third Reich. They were the approximately 700,000 Jews of North Africa, the Middle East, and Iran. And if the North Africa Corps could win the war in North Africa, it would have the Jews there as well as the Jews of Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq in its grasp. Should the Germans win the Battle of Stalingrad, they would be able to drive from the Caucasus south to Iran and Iraq, cut off the supply of oil to Britain, and further close a vice around this branch of world Jewry. Were that to happen, Hitler would be in a position to extend the final solution beyond its strictly European dimensions to implement mass murder of Jews outside Europe as well. And in fact, as historians in recent years have documented, Nazi policy and propaganda were intended to bring about precisely such an extension. Only the defeat of Rommel's Africa Corps at the Battle of El Alamein in the fall of 1942 by the armed forces of Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, and then the Soviet victory in Stalingrad in January of 1943 ended Hitler's hopes for a great pincer movement in the Middle East. The connection between the war and the Holocaust was in the Middle East and North Africa was far closer than many of the participants in those battles realized at the time. The one aspect of this argument that I want to underscore has to do with the overwhelmingly political nature of the accusation that the Nazi regime launched against the Jews. The Jews had started and escalated the Second World War in order to exterminate Germany and the Germans. The regime's frequently discussed biological racism was important primarily because it pointed to a bond said to exist among the Jews. Yet racial biology was not central to the justification for mass murder. While caricatures of the Jewish body filled the pages of Der Stürmer, the distinctively genocidal components of radical anti-Semitism derived from beliefs about what international Jewry was alleged to have done, and not how the Jews were said to appear or look. The Jews, as Goebbels famously said in one of his most important anti-Semitic tirades, practiced mimicry. That is, they were experts at camouflaging their actual identity and passing as non-Jews. The blonde-haired and blue-eyed Jews was a real nightmare for Goebbels and other Nazi leaders. It was precisely because the Nazis did not believe that they could tell who was and who was not a Jew simply by reference to biological features that they required Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe to wear the yellow star. It was the Jews' alleged actions and not their stereotypical physical features that have preoccupied so much scholarship that stood at the center of the Nazi commitment to mass murder. Moreover, when the Nazis talked about exterminating the Jews, they did so very bluntly. To be sure, the famous euphemisms such as the final solution and bureaucratic abstractions such as executive measures played an important role. And some of the previous Einspruch lectures that you've had here have illuminated that. The basic Nazi narrative about the war was so absurdly at odds with the facts that many, perhaps most observers, viewed it primarily as a clever ruse by accomplished liars. But in fact, the public language of the regime was often quite frank. Two key verbs and nouns in the German language were at the core of this language of mass murder, and neither, in any context, is a euphemism. And these famous verbs were vernichten and ausrotten, and the nouns were Vernichtung and Ausrottung, whether taken from their own dictionary meaning or placed in the context of speeches, paragraphs, and sentences in which they were uttered. The meaning of these terms of extermination, annihilation, destruction, and murder was unambiguous. When Hitler and other Nazi leaders and propagandists uttered them, they projected these very intentions and plans onto world Jewry and its plans to exterminate or annihilate not the Nazi regime or the Nazi party or the German army, but the German people as a whole. This narrative came first and foremost from Hitler himself, who was the driving force of Nazi propaganda. It was amplified by Goebbels and the propaganda ministry, including the very important Reich Press Office directed by Otto Dietrich. A large scholarly literature has documented what was obvious to contemporaries. Goebbels, the minister of public enlightenment and propaganda, played a central role. Though less well known, Dietrich was crucial for translating Hitler's radical anti-Semitism into the narrative of ongoing events that appeared in the newspaper. Dietrich's importance was established at his post-war trial in Nuremberg. Goebbels had committed suicide, as you recall. Yet, unfortunately, Dietrich remained on the margins of scholarship on the subject, dominated as it was by Goebbels' celebrity. As chief of the Reich Press Office, Dietrich worked every day in Hitler's office. He had access to the boss, and he presented a daily digest of the international press to him every morning. Hitler then offered suggestions which Dietrich conveyed as orders to his staff in Berlin, and they in turn elaborated these into Presseanweisungen, or press directives, to be handed out at a daily noon press conference. There were thousands of such directives on every conceivable subject, including that of the Jews. They were telex to editors at hundreds of newspapers and periodicals each day or week. Journalists and editors who did not follow the directives risked losing their jobs or worse. Government control of the press was thus a daily, and as far as magazines were concerned, a weekly and highly detailed exercise in dictatorial control. It is perhaps a cliche to say so, but destruction of a free press was one of the indispensable preconditions for the implementation of the Holocaust. Sometimes the journalists and editors did not implement the directives with the alacrity and the thoroughness that Dietrich preferred. And so this directive from Otto Dietrich of August 13th of 1943 is interesting. Sometimes people ask, well, did these people believe what they said in their private memos? Did it accord with their public message? And this is the confidential memo that Dietrich sent to German editors in August of 43. Quote, although the word of the day from the Reich Press Office of August 9th again clearly pointed out that Bolshevism and capitalism are the identical Jewish world swindle, only operating under different names, in the treatment of Bolshevik themes, the newspapers repeatedly succumbed to the illusion that capitalism and Bolshevism are two different and antagonistic perspectives. In particular, communist agitation is repeatedly given a boost because the press takes Bolshevik statements seriously, as if Bolshevism really wanted to destroy capitalism. In reality, both of these Jewish systems are working hand in hand with one another. Now the German press must finally put an end to this false and dangerous tendency which sabotages the line of our policy. Editors who violate this word of the day will be held personally responsible for doing so. During this period, press directives also reminded editors of the importance of underscoring the responsibility of the Jews and their alleged stooge, President Franklin Roosevelt, for the continuation of the war. To my surprise, the Jewish enemy offered for the first time an extensive examination of the hundreds of press directives that directly concerned the supposed role of the Jews during the war. And it's a book that I hope will interest journalists and has interested journalists. Hitler established the core narrative, as I pointed out, in his infamous prophecy speech of January 30th of 1939. Many of you are familiar with it. I'll refresh your memory. In his speech to the Reichstag, he publicly threatened to exterminate all the Jews of Europe in the event that international finance Jewry, inside and outside of Europe, would provoke a world war. In fact, the very same war which he was, at the moment, planning to unleash. Hitler publicly repeated the genocidal prophecy on at least 7 different occasions between January 30th of 1939 and February 24th of 1943. As if to underscore the link in his own mind between the war and his policies toward the Jews, he erroneously dated the first utterance of his prophecy as September 1st, 1939, the day he ordered the invasion of Poland. On January 30th of 1941, he said, "Not to be forgotten is the comment I've already made on September 1st, 1939, in the Reichstag, that if the world were to be pushed by Jewry into a general war, the role of the whole of Jewry in Europe would be finished." Today, the Jews may still be laughing about that statement, just as they laughed about my earlier prophecies, but now our racial knowledge is spreading from people to people. The following day, after Hitler's comment of January 30th, 1941, the editors of the New York Times, in their lead editorial, wrote the following: "Inside Germany or outside, no one in the world expects truth from Adolf Hitler. There is not a single precedent to prove he will either keep a promise or fulfill a threat. If there is any guarantee in his record, in fact, it is that the one thing he will not do is the thing he says he will do. Nobody expects consistency from Adolf Hitler." Hannah Arendt pointed out long ago that Hitler was consistent in ways that the Times editors and many other observers did not expect. Hitler repeated a variation of this statement on September 30th of 1942. But it's an interesting version. On September 1st of 1939, in the meeting of the Reichstag, I said 2 things. First, after we were forced into this war, neither the power of weapons nor the factor of time would defeat us. Second, if Jewry unleashes an international world war in order to bring about the extermination of the Aryan peoples of Europe, it will not be the Aryan peoples, but rather the Jews that will be exterminated. Long applause. The wire pullers of the lunatic in the White House have dragged one people after another into the war. To the same extent, however, an anti-Semitic wave has flooded over the peoples. It will move further and seize one state after another which enters this war. The Jews in Germany once laughed about my prophecies. I don't know if they are laughing today or if the laughter has already gone out of them, but I can promise them one thing: they will stop laughing everywhere. And with this prophecy as well, I will be proven right. More applause. Now, the clear meaning of the noun extermination and its verb exterminate, and the political and temporal context in which Hitler repeated them, as well as his assertion that he was a prophet, all indicated that he had ordered and was then implementing the destruction of the Jews. A benign interpretation of references to Jews not laughing anymore strained credulity. His audience in Berlin appeared to suffer no such handicaps. Perhaps some wondered what Hitler meant by adding everywhere to his promise to end Jewish laughter. Perhaps they assumed that as the Jewish conspiracy was international, he was seeking to extend the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe to an act of global genocide against Jews everywhere. In any case, they applauded. 6 weeks later, the above quotation from Hitler's September 30th speech appeared on approximately 125,000 copies of a poster called the Word of the Week. And the Word of the Week posters, which I'm going to show you in just a moment, appeared every week from 1937 to 1943 in specially prepared boxes that were displayed on kiosks, in university cafeterias, post offices, hotel lobbies, public places, metro stops, Actually, why don't we show it? Look at it now. I'll start with this. This is a poster that that was produced in the summer of 1941. It says, "The Jewish Conspiracy Against Europe." And this is a pictorial representation of the alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union. So you see a stereotypical Bolshevik and a stereotypical British figure shaking hands over the center and over Germany. And then here is, there is a caricatured anti-Semitic Jewish face disembodied from the body. An important component of radical anti-Semitic ideology was the disdain or contempt for the Jewish body, a lack of physical ability, all brain, no body. But the Jews are the brains, they are physical cowards, other people do the fighting. And the poster indicates that the Nazi regime is defending Europe, not just Germany, but National Socialism was a defense of Western civilization against Jewish Bolshevism and British imperialism. So this is an explanation. When Churchill got on the radio on June 22nd in 1941, right immediately when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he immediately offered an alliance to the Soviet Union. And Goebbels was very sarcastic about Churchill. He says, "This lifetime anti-communist." Churchill is famous. He supported intervention in Russia in 1917. Now he wants to get into bed with Stalin. This is absurd. What a hypocrite. Why is he doing it? Why is Churchill engaged in this alliance? Now we understand. It's because the Jews are calling the shots in London. How do we? Oops. No. I'll go. Many beautiful pictures. There it is. This is the poster that I was referring to of November, early December of 1942. And you can see here the Germans, "Das Lachen wird ihnen vergehen," they will stop laughing. And here is, it's a little difficult to see in this image. The images are in the book, The Jewish Enemy. Harvard did a wonderful job of presenting the images and preserving them. This is Franklin Roosevelt, and these are the usual suspects of Nazism's anti-Semitic, anti-American propaganda. Felix Frankfurter, Bernard Baruch, Herbert Lehman, Saul Bloom, actual people who were involved in American politics and American government, but according to the propaganda, these were the people who were really Roosevelt's brain trust in telling him what to do because he was so stupid that he couldn't figure out what to do on his own. And here is the text that I read to you on September 1st of 1939. I said, et cetera, and that the Aryan race would not be exterminated, but rather it would be the Jews, das Judentum, that would be killed. And then at the bottom it says, "And they will stop laughing everywhere." Now, historians must be careful about not going beyond their evidence, and so I don't know what the many tens of thousands of pedestrians. Germany, by the way, was overwhelmingly a pedestrian society. The ratio of car ownership was lower than in France and Britain, despite the propaganda about the Volkswagen. So there were many pedestrians in Germany, and walking to and from the metro and the bus was the way people got around town. And so people had a chance. It takes a while to read this poster. If somebody had followed Nazism and had some idea of what Hitler believed, if you had some political common sense, you could plausibly read this poster and say to yourself, the leader of the country has just told me that he is engaged in the mass murder of the Jews. That's what this poster is saying. But it is a kind of poster that also gives to the viewer that shred of plausible deniability, that absence of detail, the absence of specifics, so that you could read the poster and say, well, that's just Hitler. What do you expect? He's just boasting and saying all this nonsense. It can't really mean that he's engaged in genocide. Let's look at a few, let's go back, and I think it'd be easier if I go through these quickly. This is a poster that clearly took a while to prepare. It was distributed on December 10th of 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States on the 11th. And this is a pictorial representation of the international Jewish conspiracy. And again, it's a poster that cannot be read quickly. This takes a while. But it is of course, the color yellow is very significant. Yellow was intended to be a pejorative reference, pejoratively associated with the Jews. Art historians have done interesting work on that kind of thing. And here you have Bernard Baruch, who controls Roosevelt and somehow Churchill, and then someone named Moses Zone, which is a pejorative way of referring to Lazar Kaganovich, who was a member of the Politburo, and he has influence over Stalin, and then over the Soviet ambassador in London, Maisky, and then the text is all about how the Jews behind the scene are really running policy in Washington, Moscow, and London. This is from May of 1942. The wire pullers are all Jews. And the narrative here, this is an interpretation of contemporary history. The Jews caused World War I. They caused the start of World War I. Then they were responsible for Germany losing World War I. Then they were responsible for revolutions, attempted revolutions. And then the Jews were responsible for bringing the United States into the Second World War, a war in which the United States had no national interest involved whatsoever. There was nothing going on in Europe that was America's business, and the only reason the United States was involved in the war was because of the Jews behind the scenes. And again, the attack on Franklin Roosevelt was absolutely central to Nazi propaganda throughout the war. Roosevelt lacks his own intellectual capacity, and he needs this brain trust. And here it is, the Jew Bernard Baruch, Felix Frankfurter, Leslie Horbelisha, who was the war minister in Britain, who Neville Chamberlain sacked because Horbelisha was opposed to the appeasement policy, and Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated in 1922, so it's hard to see how he would have any influence on contemporary matters, but don't bother us with the facts. And here, the Ministry of Propaganda was called the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And the Nazis took the phrase public enlightenment quite seriously. The radical anti-Semitism was a set of ideas intended to unmask the masks fall, unmask and reveal the truth. Only the naive, uneducated, unsophisticated person believes that what's actually in the newspapers is an account of what's going on in contemporary history. The truly sophisticated, truly astute political observer knows that the real truth is always going on behind the scenes. And therefore, the Nazi propaganda ministry was revealing this truth, hence public enlightenment. It was enlightening the public by showing them what was going on. In 1940 or 41, President Roosevelt asked James Conant and Bernard Baruch to assess the energy demands of the United States during the Second World War, and they recommended a national speed limit of 55 miles, 50, might even lower than 55 miles an hour, and called for substitutes for rubber and various ways in which the United States American economy could make a transition to the war. A perfectly kind of ordinary expert commission. In this poster, it now becomes a committee intended to set up an economic dictatorship in the United States and control the whole country. And here, the poster reveals who are the true rulers of the United States. And yet again, the true rulers of the United States were Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, Felix Frankfurter, Saul Bloom, Fiorella LaGuardia, whose mother was Jewish, and Cordell Hull, whose wife was supposedly Jewish. So this was as absurd as it seems, was the political explanation. This is a very interesting poster because those of you who know something about the World War II in Europe know that overwhelmingly the Second World War on land was fought between Berlin and Moscow, and that overwhelmingly it was the armed forces of this man here, Joseph Stalin, who were wiping out the Wehrmacht. And that the armed forces of this man here didn't arrive in France until 1944, in Italy 1943, and that of the three powers, Britain was the smallest. But the photo reverses the actual relations of power, so that Roosevelt's photo is now the largest. And the text is who is guilty of the war. Roosevelt and Churchill bear the responsibility for this war, and behind them stands the Jew. Hitler was convinced, and he had a point, that Franklin Roosevelt had denied him victory in the Second World War when he might have won it. If Roosevelt had not fought the Battle of the Atlantic, had not conveyed weapons and supplies to Britain between 1939 to 1941, it's conceivable that the British might have been forced to compromise. So Roosevelt's policy before the United States entered the war denied Hitler the early victory he sought. And the aid the United States gave to the Soviet Union and Britain was of great importance. So there was a certain logic to this poster of understanding the centrality of the American role in the Second World War. This is one of the most important iconic images of the Holocaust and of the Second World War. The Nazis, by 1943, understood that, especially if they wanted to put propaganda in occupied Europe, it was better to have posters with less text and with a small amount of text. And so this poster says, "Behind the enemy powers stands the Jew." And here is the stereotypical anti-Semitic caricature: overweight, civilian clothes, millions of young men are thin and in uniform. This horrible fellow is overweight and counting his money, and what is he doing? He is hiding behind the flags of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and he's running the show. So here is the mass murderer, here is the man who is killing the Germans, and this is a justification for retaliation. And this is a more famous poster, maybe some of you have seen it. The Jew is guilty for this war. And then the Jew is the warmonger, and etc. So that was the visual presentation of the messages that I've been discussing. Joseph Goebbels spoke on the radio, or wrote an essay in a journal called Das Reich, the government, every week. And he either read it on Friday evening or it was tape recorded and it was read again on Sunday afternoon. On November 16th of 1941, his weekly article was called "The Jews Are Guilty." And it was one of his most important contributions to the Holocaust. It marked the first time that a leading official of the Nazi regime publicly announced that the extermination of the Jews in Europe was taking place. Before then, before November 16th, 1941, the if-then hypothetical structure of Hitler's famous prophecy had been the rule. It now gave way to an assertion of ongoing action. And this is what he said: "By unleashing this war, world Jewry completely misjudged the forces at its disposal. Now, it is suffering a gradual process of annihilation, which it had intended for us and which it would have unleashed against us without hesitation if it had the power to do so. It is now perishing as a result of its own law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In this historical dispute, every Jew is our enemy," and then it just gets too disgusting. I won't continue. "They wish for its defeat, our defeat and annihilation, and do everything in their power to help bring it about." So, The Jews had started the war. They were now suffering a gradual process of extermination that they had originally intended to inflict on us. And the War on the Jews, which was another essay he published in 1943, in May of 43, included the following statement: "We are moving ahead. The fulfillment of the Führer's prophecy, about which world jury laughed in 1939 when he made it, stands at the end of our course of action. Even in Germany, the Jews laughed when we stood up for the first time against them. Amongst them, laughter is now a thing of the past." Hitler, as you know, committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in his bunker on April 30th of 1945. On April 29th, he had written his political testament. He wrote that it was not true that I or anyone else in Germany wanted war in 1939. It was desired and launched exclusively by those international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or who worked for Jewish interests. The truly guilty party of this murderous battle is Jewry. He had, quote, left no one in doubt that this time millions of adult men would not die and hundreds of thousands of women and children burn in the cities and die under bombardment without the really guilty party having to pay for his guilt, albeit with more humane means. To the end, he persisted in the paranoid logic of innocence, irresponsibility, and projection. The logical conclusion of Hitler's statement was that international Jewry, in the form of the anti-Hitler coalition, had won the Second World War. Hitler's last will has often been interpreted as evidence of his descent into madness under the impact of impending total defeat. And those of you who saw the recent film Untergang, Downfall, saw that this filmmaker conveyed that impression. Yet what is most striking about Hitler's last will, against the background of Nazi propaganda, is that in the bunker, he simply restated what he had been saying publicly since the beginning of the war. He voiced the murderous prophecy on January 30th of 1939, 8 months before he started the war. He and his associates gave vent to it following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 41. As the final solution began, they did so again as the extermination camps went into operation in 1942 and as the tide of war turned against Germany in winter and spring of 43, and in the 2 following years as the war eventually came home to Germany. This paranoid vision of an international Jewish conspiracy waging aggressive and genocidal war against an innocent Germany that flowed from his pen on April 29th of 1945 had been the core element of the text and imagery of the Nazi regime's anti-Semitic propaganda from the beginning of the war to its end. In the past several years, historians in the United States and Germany and Israel have documented and interpreted the history of ideological and political collaboration between leading officials of the Nazi regime with a number of prominent radical Arab nationalists and Islamist leaders. And this raises the issue I raised at the outset about the possible extension of the Holocaust beyond Europe. As a result, our knowledge has grown considerably about Nazi Germany's efforts to extend and spread its ideas in North Africa and the Middle East. The wartime collaboration between the Nazi regime and radical Arab and radical Islamist collaborators made a significant contribution to the adaptation of Nazi ideology to the region. It constituted a chapter in the history of the diffusion of radical anti-Semitism to the Middle East and to Iran. It was at the center of a process of cultural fusion between European forms of radical anti-Semitism and Islamist forms of that hatred, drawing on a selective reading of the Quran and the commentaries about it. It was an important chapter in the longer history of the ideological tradition known as Islamism, not Islam, but Islamism, a hybrid of European and Islamist ideology that began in the Middle East in the 1920s, found refuge in Nazi Berlin during the war, persisted in the post-war decades in the Muslim Brotherhood, shaped parts of Palestinian nationalism, and in recent decades has inspired terrorism of Islamist jihadis in Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the policies of the government of Iran. To be sure, there were currents of Arab politics that opposed Nazism and fascism. My colleague Israel Gershoni at the University of Tel Aviv has written intelligently and reliably about Arab anti-fascism. Yet one of the distinctive features of Arab radicalism after World War II, and one that distinguished it from other aspects of third world radicalism in this period, was the extent to which elements of Nazi ideology and radical anti-Semitism became respectable aspects of parts of Arab nationalism and especially Islamist discourse. This cultural fusion between the radicalization of European, German, and Christian forms of anti-Semitism with those resting on a selective reading of the traditions of Islam took place first and foremost in the propaganda offices of Nazi Germany's foreign ministry, and to a lesser extent in the SS and in the propaganda ministry. Its primary medium was shortwave radio broadcasts beamed from Germany to North Africa and the Middle East. There was also a Persian language program. It took place from the fall of 1939 to March of 1945. The Nazi regime was on the air 7 days and nights a week with Arabic language broadcasts. These broadcasts included several hours of news and commentary every evening. As the literacy rates of the Society of the Middle East and North Africa during the war was about 20%, and in some cases less for Muslims and still less for Muslim women, radio was by far the most effective means of reaching the politically engaged minorities of the region. American intelligence agencies estimated that there were about 50,000 shortwave radios in Egypt, 10,000 in Palestine, and 15,000 in Lebanon and Syria. Radios were often heard by groups of listeners in cafes. Information about audience reception and size remains scarce. The broadcasts were aimed at a relatively small audience that had access to these radios and was already inclined to favor the Axis powers. These broadcasts combined secular and religious components. Some Nazi officials preferred to limit propaganda to appeals to Arab anti-imperialism directed against Britain, while others were more comfortable with explicit appeals to the traditions of Islam. In practice, in the same texts and broadcasts, the distinction blurred into insignificance. Nazi officials and diplomats understood that before the war began, the Third Reich's hostility to Zionism was one of its major political advantages in efforts to secure support in the region. And conversely, despite Britain's white paper and Roosevelt's wartime refusal to clearly support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Nazis, as well as leading American and British officials, believed that the association of the Allies with the Jews and with Zionism was a hindrance to Allied efforts to gain support for their war effort in the region. No aspect of Nazi propaganda, no aspect of Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda, fused its secular and religious dimensions more effectively than did its persistent and vehement attack on Zionism. The collaboration, about which I'll speak more in a moment, between Arab exiles fleeing from the British, between them and the officials of the foreign ministry, meant that the propaganda was a joint effort. The German diplomats had had experience, some German diplomats had had experience serving in embassies in the region. Some of them had participated in efforts to wage holy jihad against Britain and France during World War I. And as a result, they understood that Hitler's Mein Kampf posed a problem for Nazi Germany's efforts to find allies among Arabs and Muslims. And the reason that Mein Kampf posed a problem was that Hitler was a conventional racist, in the sense that his anti-Semitism expressed contempt for Arabs and for Muslims as well. And so they made sure that there was no unabridged Arabic translation of the famous book. And they wanted to convince Arab diplomats that the Nazi regime was not an anti-Semitic government. It was an anti-Jewish government. This came to a head during the Berlin Olympics of 1936, when some of the Egyptian Olympic officials threatened not to come to the Berlin Olympics because of the Nuremberg race laws. And German diplomats explained to them that they misunderstood the Nuremberg race laws. The Nuremberg race laws were not directed against non-Aryans, they were directed against the Jews. And as the Arabs were not Jewish, they were certainly welcome in Berlin at the Olympics. And subsequently, Nazi propaganda, whether it was in German or Arabic or any other language, never used the term anti-Semitism. We are not an anti-Semitic regime. We are a regime of Judengegner, of enemies, antagonists of the Jews. Now, we're doing all right. Many of you are familiar with the role of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, in this story. He is the central figure. His enthusiasm for Nazism came to the attention of the German consulate in Jerusalem as early as 1933. The evidence of Nazi propaganda for the Arab world and other recent works by Klaus Gensike, Martin Coopers, Matthias Kunzel, to name just a few, Paul Berman, is sufficient to confirm his active enthusiasm. Recently, in time to include in the paperback edition of Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, the German political scientist and contemporary historian, my friend, Matthias Kunzel, has found additional evidence that Husseini had produced one of Islamism's founding texts well before he came to Berlin in 1941. When we use the expression Nazi propaganda for the Arab world, some people might interpret it to mean that the Germans are the active member of this enterprise and the Arabs were kind of copying or the passive recipients. And the point I want to make about talking about the text I'm about to mention is that Husseini, Yunus Bari, and others of the entourage that arrived in Berlin in November of 1941 were active participants and made a creative and important contribution to a fusion of different traditions of Jew hatred. While avoiding arrest by British authorities, Husseini organized an all-Arab conference, a pan-Arab conference of 400 delegates that was held on September 8th and 9th, 1937 in Baladan, Syria. He was not able to attend because the British were after him, but a text that he wrote was read in his absence. The following year, Islam and the Jews was published in German, in a series on the idea and form of National Socialism. And the title of the text was The Grand Mufti's Appeal to the Islamic World in 1937. It is almost certainly the same text that he delivered to the delegates in Baladan. Islam and the Jews offered a remarkably elaborated reading of the Quran that placed Jew hatred into a millennial time span and applied it to modern times as well. Its publication in a German edition in 1938 in Berlin meant that Husseini's distinctively Islamist Jew hatred could be known by those in the German government and academic circles who followed developments in the Arab world. And here is just a short selection from the Baladan text. The battle between Jews and Islam, he wrote, began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. Therefore, the Jews were seized with a deep hatred against Islam. This hatred intensified the stronger and more powerful Islam became. In those days, the Jewish methods were exactly the same as they are today. Then as now, slander was their weapon. They said Muhammad was a swindler. They tried to undermine his honor. They began to pose senseless and unanswerable questions to Muhammad. And then they tried to annihilate the Muslims. And just as the Jews were able to betray Muhammad, so they will betray the Muslims today. The verses of the Quran and the Hadith assert that the Jews were Islam's most bitter enemy, and moreover, they try to destroy it. Husseini saw in his depiction of Jewish supposed hostility to Muhammad an early version of Zionism's designs on Palestine. The Syrian-born German historian and political scientist, student of international affairs, and expert on Islam and Arab politics, Bassam Tibi, has referred to Islamism as an invented tradition, a particular product of the 20th century. Husseini's texts from the Baladan Conference in 1937 was one of its founding moments. Because I want to leave time for questions and answers, I'm going to skip some details here and summarize some things. Alexander Kirk was one of the great diplomats of American history in the 20th century. He was the charge d'affaires of the American embassy in wartime, in pre-war Berlin. And there, he wrote memos back to Secretary of State Cordell Hull about the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany. And Alexander Kirk had contact with the very small and the ineffectual anti-Nazi resistance. And when the war broke out, Kirk went from Berlin to Cairo, and he became the head of what was then the American legation, and subsequently he became the American ambassador to Egypt during the Second World War. The American embassy in wartime Cairo became one of the most important American embassies in the world, one of the largest, and it was in the Cairo embassy that American intelligence and military operations in the Mediterranean were run. It was one of the most important American embassies in the world. And Kirk arrived in Cairo with a determination to do everything he could to defeat Nazi Germany, and was convinced that the battle in North Africa and the Mediterranean was crucial for this outcome. He established a staff of native Arabic speakers and translators who produced, over the course of the following 4 years, 3,000 pages of verbatim English language transcripts of Nazi Germany's Arabic language radio broadcasts to Egypt and to the Middle East. They were called Axis broadcasts in Arabic. Axis broadcasts in Arabic was declassified by the National Archives of the United States in 1977. The National Archives of the United States are a mile from my office at the University of Maryland. And from 1977 to 2007, Axis broadcasts in Arabic either went unread, or if scholars read it, they didn't find it interesting enough to publish anything about it. And I came across them in 2007. And the result was that I could write Nazi propaganda for the Arab world. German companies invented the tape recorder in the 1930s. And the German language propaganda is recorded on tape. And the German radio archives in Frankfurt Main have a vast record of Hitler and Goebbels and others and their major speeches. We even have a tape recording, as Richard Breitman may have told you when he spoke here, of Heinrich Himmler's famous speech in Posen. Himmler taped his admission of what the SS had been doing. But the Arabic language broadcasts were either never taped, or if so, the tapes were destroyed, and the transcripts, if they were written down, they must have been written down because they were very detailed, were destroyed or stolen, or they're hidden, or they're not in any archive in Germany or Britain or the United States, and if they are somewhere in the Middle East, they have not yet come to light. But as a result, ironically, the most extensive piece of evidence that we have regarding Nazi Germany's Arabic language broadcasts is in English in the archives of the United States State Department. As you know, historians don't write the absolute truth about the past. We use the best evidence available. And we have to make decisions about, we're aware of our shortcomings, but when I look at what the broadcasts were saying in German, when I look at Husseini's texts in German, and then I look at what the Americans were recording in Cairo, it sounds to me, and it sounds to other experts, as if these transcripts, these translations, are quite reliable. I'm going to just say one or two more things, and then I think I'll bring this to a close. On November 28th of 1941, Husseini had a very famous meeting with Hitler, and he showered Hitler with praise. And he asked Hitler to issue a declaration in support of Arab independence from British colonialism. And Hitler put him off a bit and said it wasn't quite time to issue such a declaration, but it was coming. It was coming. When the German armies on the Eastern Front, Hitler told him, according to the notes of the meeting, when they have reached the southern exit of Europe from the Caucasus, that is, assuming they would win the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler would give the Arab world the assurance that its hour of liberation had arrived. Germany's objective, he continued, would then be solely the destruction of the Jewish element residing in the Arab sphere under the protection of British power. In other words, in the same period, October, November 1941, when Christopher Browning and Saul Friedlander and Philip Baran and Richard Breitman, Christian Gerlach, and many other historians, Raoul Hilberg, have concluded that by then, certainly by then, Hitler had taken the final decisions, the decisions to launch the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. He had also told Husseini that he intended to extend it as well outside Europe, that is, at least to the Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East, to those 700,000 Jews. And so the broadcasts are interesting in that regard. And I will just read a few to you. As some of you know, the United Nations Prevention of Genocide Convention of 1948 includes a clause on incitement to mass murder. Use of the mass media to incite mass murder is part of the crime of genocide. Otto Dietrich, who I mentioned earlier, was in fact convicted of crimes against humanity in Nuremberg for the role that he played in sending press directives out along the lines that I indicated earlier. Husseini was on the radio often, celebrating German victories. It's not clear if this was Husseini or Yunus Bari, or it's not clear who was speaking at 8:15 p.m. in Cairo time on July 7th of 1942. And this was a moment of euphoria in Berlin. It looked as if the Nazis were going to win the war in North Africa, that Rommel might win the Battle of El Alamein. And if he won the Battle of El Alamein, they would come to Cairo and they would come to Palestine and they would win the war and they would take on the Jews. And there was an SS unit, we now know, in Athens prepared to come to Egypt to do what the Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe had been doing, that is, killing the Jews with bullets. And so the Americans in Cairo recorded this broadcast. The title was "Kill the Jews Before They Kill You." And it began with a lie that the Egyptian government had distributed weapons to Jews and Armenians and French and Greeks who were fleeing from Nazi-occupied Europe in the event that the Germans came. In the face of this barbaric procedure by the British, we think it best, if the life of the Egyptian nation is to be saved, that the Egyptians rise as one man to kill the Jews before they have a chance of betraying the Egyptian people. It's the duty of the Egyptians to annihilate the Jews and destroy their property. You must kill the Jews before they open fire on you. Kill the Jews who have appropriated your wealth. Arabs of Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, what are you waiting for? And it just goes on. Now, it is impossible to be more blunt than this. The difference between the incitement on the radio aimed at the Arab world and the incitement in Germany, in the German language propaganda, was that the German language propaganda was a promise, a reassurance. The Jews are attempting to kill all of us, but rest assured, we are exterminating them. We, your government, are coming to your defense, and we are exterminating the Jewish enemy. Rest assured, we are doing our duty. The Germans did not have a presence in Egypt or in Palestine or in Syria. They were not there on the ground, so they couldn't make the same promise. And so what the incitement on the radio was about was a call for audience participation. Take matters into your own hands and do it yourself. I can talk a little bit more about the assessment by the British and the Americans of the impact of this propaganda. I can tell a little story about Heinrich Himmler's suggestion that the Nazis that the Nazis write a leaflet, a pamphlet that would present Hitler as a messenger from Allah, sent to earth to kill the Jews, which they did. They did produce a leaflet of that nature. In June of 1945, Robert Jackson, Supreme Court Robert Jackson, was preparing the Nuremberg trials, and he was interested in finding out how various countries would respond to war crimes trials. And so he asked President Truman to ask William Donovan, the head of the Office of Strategic Services, to ask the intelligence desk dealing with the Middle East to see how people in the region would respond to indictments. In June of 23rd of 1945, the OSS report on the Near East and the war crimes problem concluded the following. In the Near East, the popular attitude toward the trial of war criminals is one of apathy. As a result of the general Near Eastern feeling of hostility to the imperialism of one of the Allied powers, Britain, there is a tendency to sympathize with, rather than condemn, those who have aided the Axis. A year later, in 1946, Hashim al-Husseini returned to a hero's welcome in Egypt. The reaction offered an example of what the OSS analysts had in mind. On June 11th of 1946, Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, sent this statement to the officials of the Arab League, and the OSS got a hold of it. The Muslim Brotherhood and all Arabs request that the Arab League, on which Arab hopes are pinned, declare that the Mufti is welcome to stay in any Arab country he may choose, and that great welcome should be extended to him wherever he goes, as a sign of appreciation for his great services for the glory of Islam and the Arabs. The hearts of the Arabs palpitated with joy at hearing that the Mufti has succeeded in reaching an Arab country. What a hero! What a miracle of a man! Yes, this hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. God entrusted him with a mission, and he must succeed. The Lord Almighty did not preserve Amin for nothing. There must be a divine purpose behind the preservation of the life of this man, namely the defeat of Zionism. Amin, march on. God is with you. We are behind you. We are willing to sacrifice our necks for the cause. To death, forward march. To write that Germany and Hitler were gone, but that Husseini would continue the struggle against the criminal British and against Zionism gave the impression that it was the same struggle as before. Al-Banna called the victors in Europe armies of colonization. If this was the same struggle, who better to play a leading role than a political and religious leader with experience in fighting the enemy? Far from criticizing Husseini for having sided with Hitler in Germany, Al-Banna expressed admiration. Living in wartime Egypt, Al-Banna and the members of the Brotherhood would have had the opportunity to hear what Husseini and others said on the radio about the Jews and the Allies. And it was these words and actions he found so admirable. And moreover, Husseini's survival and escape and arrival in Cairo were proof to him that God approved as well. In 1950, Said Qutb, the leading ideological figure of the Muslim Brotherhood, and one whose writings have inspired Islamists ever since, wrote an essay entitled Our Struggle with the Jews. It was translated in 1986 into English and has been available since then in English. It was republished by the Saudi government in 1970. Qutb attacked the Jews for their presumably ancient hatred of Islam. The Jews had disobeyed Allah for centuries, and Allah had punished them, but they refused to listen. And finally, he said, Allah sent Hitler to punish the Jews. So Qutb did not deny the extermination of Europe's Jews. On the contrary, he justified an extermination which had taken place. Scholars have not yet established where Qutb got this idea about Allah sending Hitler to punish the Jews. It certainly wasn't only from a reading of the Quran and the Hadith. So, in conclusion, for most of the 66 years since the end of World War II and the Holocaust, historians have written about it to document and interpret events that were produced by ideologies and political traditions that had been defeated, disgraced, and delegitimated. Nazism and radical anti-Semitism that formed its ideological core were a part of Europe's past and not its post-war history. Such ideas ceased to be major factors in any major country in Europe. Anti-Semitism as a political factor also drastically declined in American life. The Arab-Israeli conflict appeared to be one primarily about land and borders and amenable thus to the give and take of negotiations. The recent burst of scholarship I've briefly discussed this afternoon casts a rather more sober view. In contrast to the ex-Nazis in Europe, Husseini did not have to change his views to purchase a re-entry ticket to continued political prominence. In the decade following the end of the war, he remained the most important leader of the Palestinian national movement. From 1946 on, after Husseini's return to the region, the Arab Higher Committee functioned again in Palestine. In the words of Edward Said, the Arab Higher Committee, when chaired by Husseini, represented the Palestinian Arab national consensus. The coming to terms with Husseini's past and with the emergence of radical anti-Semitism among radical nationalists and radical Islamists, from Qutb and Husseini to the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Mr. Karadari, not to mention the government of Iran, remains a task for a younger generation of historians who can read Arab and Farsi, and I hope for a young generation of Arabs who will live, hopefully, in a democratic, in a set of democratic Arab societies. We do know that one important chapter in the history of Islamist terror of our own time was written in Nazi Berlin. In 1976, Karl Bracher, who I mentioned earlier, one of Germany's finest historians of Nazism, wrote that the history of Nazism was also the history of its underestimation. Again and again, as I've indicated this afternoon, the Nazis declared their clear intentions for all to hear, and just as frequently, many sophisticated observers concluded that Hitler and his associates did not really mean what they were saying. In recent decades, the demented discourse of radical anti-Semitism has returned in different idioms and in different cultural contexts. The insight that history is not the product of conspiracy and that political events are full of contingency is an antidote that, though often taken for granted, is yet among the most important a historian can offer to this most lethal of all ideological passions. One of the lessons of my historical scholarship on the Holocaust is that in our own time, we should not repeat the underestimation of radical anti-Semitism that took place between 1919 and 1945. Given what we know about how the Holocaust took place, this is the least we can do to see that a second Holocaust does not happen. Thank you. A number of questions are of the variety of why didn't you write the book I would have liked to have written? When everyone gives a lecture, there are a lot of those questions. So those are the questions I'm going to answer last. And then there are questions that address what I said. So I'll address those questions first, because you're the better listeners. Was the German paranoia real or just a tool for justification for their plans for power? One of the problems of interpreting National Socialism was that many of the highly educated and sophisticated people who were active in politics in Germany, whether they were on the left or the right, and people making policy in Britain and in Washington, viewed Nazi ideology precisely as a tool for other purposes. And one of the most important people who took this view was a man named Franz Neumann, who was a German Jewish refugee, a left-wing intellectual, who was the director of the Department of Research and Analysis at the Office of Strategic Services in Washington, D.C., and whose responsibility it was to give Bill Donovan the best assessment of the Nazi regime. And Neumann wrote a book in 1942 and then revised it in 1944 called Behemoth, The Structure and Practice of National Socialism. And in that book, Neumann, which was published before the full revelation of the Holocaust, argued that the Nazis would never exterminate the Jews because the Jews were a scapegoat that were useful for the regime to blame for social and economic problems. So why would the regime murder the scapegoat and get rid of the safety valve? And this was a classic analysis of the notion that anti-Semitism was a tool. There was a Polish refugee working in the Office of Strategic Services, a Mr. Dwork, who lost the internal inner office battles with Dr. Neumann, and Dwork argued they mean what they say. And Dwork was right, Neumann was wrong. But Neumann was far more typical, as was the editorial board of the New York Times. People who are educated who read the Western political tradition are from Machiavelli through Marx, through Tocqueville, Burke, what have you, are educated in a kind of skepticism, sometimes cynicism, about the role of ideas. And this was one of those examples in which Hitler's anti-Semitism was a genuine conviction. And one of the reasons that Winston Churchill was the great figure that he was his cultural antenna. We think of many other aspects of Churchill's greatness, but it was Churchill's cultural interpretation, his understanding that Hitler meant what he said, that distinguished his understanding of what was going on from many other people at the time. So, but the questioner has a point in asking about the tool aspect, because it was both, for the Nazi regime, anti-Semitism was both a tool, it was both a matter of conviction, but it was also a tool. And, for example, in attempting to undermine support for the war effort in the United States, the Nazis believed that anti-Semitism was an important tool. In the 1930s, survey research began in the United States. And one of the questions that the National Opinion Research Corporation and the people at the University of Chicago began asking was, do the Jews have too much power? And are Jews willing to fight as well as other people? And these were measures of anti-Semitic sentiment in the United States. And according to these surveys, anti-Semitism in American history peaked in June of 1944 when American soldiers stormed the beaches in Normandy. That was the high point of anti-Semitism in our country's history. And in that sense, the Nazis hoped to identify Roosevelt with the Jews were cowards, the Jews were not fighting, this was a war to save the Jews. And the thing that Roosevelt and the government were terrified about was that in the public imagination, this would become a war to save the Jews, which raises a lot of other controversies that Richard Breitman and others are going to be addressing in a book that he's working on FDR and the Jews. So it was both conviction and a tool. But just because something is a tool doesn't mean you don't believe it's true. Let me see. What could we have said to the Germans in the 1920s to prevent such an event, given our current knowledge? Well, there were other Germanys that had to be defeated. There were many Germans who fought against Nazism, as you know. The biggest mistake of American foreign policy of the 20th century was the decision of the United States Senate, in its wisdom, not to ratify the League of Nations treaties. And when the United States ceased to be a member of the League of Nations, its influence in European politics dwindled. The credibility of and the ability of France and Britain to restrain Germany and deter Hitler was much weakened. So there was less the United States could say as a result of that. But I also would want to make a point here about contingency. I asked my students last week, we were at this point in one of my courses, what percentage of the vote did the Nazi Party get before the Depression in 1928? And so the estimates of my students ranged between 30% on the low end and 50% on the high end. And as many of you know, the correct figure is 2.8% in 1928. 2.8% in 1928, before the Depression. So there were a great deal had to go wrong before Hitler could come to power. And both Karl Bracher and the British historian Ian Kershaw have, in different ways, made a similar point. There was no seizure of power in 1933. The ability of the Nazis party to become the Nazi regime was because the mainstream conservative forces in Germany concluded that they decided to invite him into power. They, in that sense, and they were convinced that inviting him into power would tame him and moderate him. And this is part of what Bracher called underestimation. So the lesson, of course, that Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and the American foreign policy establishment drew after Pearl Harbor and during the war was that if the United States wanted to continue to have influence in Europe, it could not again retreat, that the American national security had to begin by sustaining a balance of power in Europe. So do we have tools in our toolbox to prevent another Holocaust? Those of you who've read my articles or essays in the New Republic online know that I have a lot of opinions about that. But the answer is yes. But I'd rather not get into a longer discussion about Iran because that would take us afield from today's topic. Anti-Semitism has not disappeared. Do you see today's economic situation with so many Jewish names in economic planning and treasury leading to a strong anti-Jewish feeling? Well, we have dodged a bullet, haven't we? We have dodged a bullet. With the economic crisis of 2008 and Alan Greenspan and the like, and the transformation of the Wall Street Journal and American conservatism is a very important transformation in American life. The Wall Street Journal flirted with anti-Semitism in the 1930s and 40s. The economic crisis of 2008, Goldman Sachs, the Lehman Brothers, this could have been a disaster for the American Jewish community. And I can see Professor Oshvat is asking me to conclude. I'll say this. I'll just say one last point about contemporary American anti-Semitism, about a bullet that we dodged, and it comes from the academy, not from the street. The bullet came from the academy in the form of John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt's book, The Israel Lobby. At a time when the Iraq War was going very badly, and many, many young people were being killed and wounded, and millions and millions, billions of dollars are being spent on a war whose decision makers were Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice. Academics from the University of Chicago and Harvard University said the Jews are guilty, that it was Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and Scooter Libby, and these are the guilty figures, and the Israel Lobby that drove us into this war. That was dangerous, because that essentially was a blood libel. It was saying that the Jews have caused this war. And it was a somewhat milder version of the conspiracy theory that I've been discussing. It wasn't the same. Nothing is ever exactly the same. But it was dangerous. And I want to say something about the University of Texas at Dallas and about how important this program is and how there's been a failure in the Ivy League, and there's been a failure at Chicago, and a failure at other elite institutions. Because some of us were willing to say that the argument of the Israel lobby is an anti-Semitic argument. We don't know if John Mearsheimer has been, I've known him for many years, he's not an anti-Semite in that sense. But we said that. And I noted that my colleagues, my friends, my colleagues in the Ivy League, at Chicago, at the big research institutions, were remarkably silent about this issue. They weren't there using their eloquence to make this point. And that was a dangerous moment. And fortunately, it passed, and this argument did not become an enduring feature of American political life. And thank goodness. Thanks for your patience.